Alright guys, so here's a Ford Taurus with the dual overhead cam V6 and early 2000s. We're going to be doing an oil pan gasket and a brake master cylinder. And basically what you're going to want to start doing is taking the exhaust mid piece out. So there's two bolts right here which you can see I already took out. It's going to require an extension and a 15 millimeter and possibly an impact, but you could probably do it with a socket wrench or a breaker bar. And then the next thing that you need to take out are these bolts right here. You might need a torch or just soak them in penetrating oil for a few days. You can soak it and then drive it, it doesn't matter, but you might need to soak it quite a bit to get them loose and freed up. And then you're going to want to take out the oxygen sensors after each cat, and then that's going to, or you could unplug them, that's the other option. I'm just going to take them out. If they don't come out, you can unplug them. And then this whole piece will come down and give you access to the oil pan. So I'll show you the bolts over there on that side for that cat. Here are the bolts for this back pipe. Doesn't look like it has a cat on it. I guess they just have that cat for this rear cylinder. You can see those bolts, and I should be able to fit up in there and get those. They look pretty rusty, so I'm going to go ahead and try. Okay, so to get the one exhaust bolt out, I ended up having to, it stripped, so I had to put it was a 13 millimeter, and I had to hammer a 12 millimeter 12 point onto it and heat it up red hot with the torch. So I'll need new bolts for the manifold, and like I said, you could probably put penetrating oil on that to get that off, but I have a torch, so it's not worth the time of waiting. But I started pulling these bolts off, and then I started pulling the bolts off of there. That's two 10 millimeter nuts, and then there's a bunch of 14 millimeter bolts on this bracket that you can access. One's on the motor, it looks like, and then the rest of them are on the transmission. And now that that bracket's out, I'm going to take the rest of these 12 millimeter bolts off around the pan except for one on the end, and then I'll take these out right here by the transmission, and then I'll pull the pan off. And now that all the 13 millimeter oil pan bolts are out, it should come off. And don't forget there's two bolts hiding in here behind this little transmission cover. Now this is what it looks like once you get the oil pan off. You can kind of inspect the timing chain and see how much wear it has and all that good stuff. Kind of feel up in there and make sure it's not loose at all. Should seems fine. Everything looks pretty clean under here. You can feel this connecting rod and see if it's loose at all. If it's not, and then pull this gasket off. This gasket's in pretty rough shape. I'll do a comparison between this and the other. Right here you can see how bent out of shape it is. It's like way out of whack. Like all kinds of bent out of shape. So that's good. I'm going to go ahead and show you the pan. Here's the pan. I'm going to go ahead and get it pressure washed and cleaned up. Now that that's all washed off inside and out, I'm going to go ahead and clean all the RTV off of the bottom of the main girdle surface. Now that I got that all done, I'm just going to make sure that everything is nice and clean and then start to put the other oil pan on. But you have to put a dab of RTV Ultra Black right here and right here, and that's going to keep it from leaking out of this crack. Alright, so I got the oil pan back on and I torqued them all down starting at the corners to 9 foot-pounds and then torqued them from the back to the front at 9 foot-pounds. Then I tightened these bolts down and then I put that bracket back on. It's a lot easier to access it from over there in the wheel well with an extension. It's a lot easier that way. And then I put new exhaust studs in there by running the nut all the way down to that little flare right there, and then it impacted on, and then I backed the nut off and then went up and down the threads to clean the nut back off. And now I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the exhaust. Alright, so I got those two nuts on, those studs, and then I plugged the oxygen sensor in and tucked it away. Now I'm going to go ahead and thread this oxygen sensor in, make sure that that goes in before I tighten those bolts up top, and then I'll tighten those bolts up top and then put this pipe back on, hopefully with the old nuts. Alright, so I got those two nuts on. I had to use a new one because one of them flew away. And then I'm going to put this little shield on, back on the oil pan / transmission. Alright, so I got those two nuts back on, and I went ahead and put a little bit of anti-seize on it. Now I'm going to move on to the brake master cylinder. So now that everything's done down here, we're going to look up here, and there should be two lines that need to come off. But first I'm going to suck all the fluid out of the master cylinder with my siphon. Alright, so then you can use a regular wrench, but I use these special line wrenches. And you're going to want to take these lines off completely and try not to get it on the paint, because that's going to tear up the paint. And then the other line is over there, so I'll probably need to unplug that connector. Alright, now I got those lines removed, so you're going to need a decent amount of tools to get these nuts off of this master cylinder here. You can kind of see them, they're down there. That one you can really see right there. So I'm just going to basically need to kind of take my time and get those off. And now with the master cylinder removed, you can see how dangerous it was. See that fluid leaking out of the back there? Not good. Junk. Alright, I carefully installed the nuts on the new master cylinder, and it's nice and tight. Now I'm going to go ahead and pull these little yellow caps out and then start putting the brake lines back into it. Alright, so I got that all installed. Now it's time to bleed the brakes. And I forgot to mention that when you get the new brake master cylinder in, you're just going to keep pumping the brakes and then letting off until the bubbles are all out and it gets hard. Eventually the bubbles will be displaced with brake fluid, and then it will be stiff again, and then you can proceed to bleed the brakes at the calipers. Okay, so I'm going to try it a little differently and just have this hand tight, or just a little bit on there, and then I'm going to pump the brake. Alright, so now the pedal doesn't go down as far as it did before, so I'd say that it's pretty close with that, just cracking the line and then letting it air out, and then it can't suck quite as much air in, and then now it can pump fluid to bleed the brakes the rest of the way. When you bleed the brakes, you're going to want to start with the rear right, and then do the rear left, and then the front right, and then the front left. And you're going to want to bleed the brakes normally, like open the valve and then have someone push the brakes, and then close the valve and tell them to let off. And then do that, and then once you stop getting air bubbles through it, then you're going to pump up the brakes, have them hold it, and then you're going to have them tell you before it hits the floor, and then you're going to open the valve, and then ideally you wouldn't let the brake pedal hit the floor, and that's going to get that last little air pocket out of that caliper or brake cylinder if you have drum brakes, and that's the correct way to do it. You don't just pump up the brakes and then hold it and then do it that way, because it just doesn't get all the air bubbles out of the line, especially when you do a master cylinder change. You want to let it pump out when you press the brake, and then when you let off, you want that valve to be closed so it sucks new fluid back into the line. And that's how you correctly get all the bubbles out, and then it won't have air bubbles in the system.
But that's it.